It is the summer of 1999. NATO bombs rain down on the Yugoslav capital of Belgrade in response to the country's actions in Kosovo. 10 years earlier, the man responsible for his country's imminent demise had set out to save the federal state of Yugoslavia from breaking apart as it was racked by ethnic and religious divisions. Then, as wars of independence broke out, Belgrade resorted to ever more desperate and violent measures, culminating in mass killings and ethnic cleansing. Ultimately, in the aftermath of the collapse of Yugoslavia, the same man who many see as the architect of this widespread slaughter is arrested and charged for war crimes. His name? Slobodan Milosevic, the Butcher of the Balkans.
The man known to history as Slobodan Milosevic was born on the 20th of August 1941 in Požarevac, a city about an hour's drive east of the capital of Serbia, Belgrade, in what was then Yugoslavia. His father was Svetozar Milosevic, a musically gifted theologian and amateur poet of the Christian Orthodox Church from Montenegro, who was 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes and brown hair. His mother was Stanislava Milosevic, a slim brown-eyed Montenegrin woman who worked for a time as a primary school teacher. In 1935, soon after the birth of their first child, Slobodan's older brother Borislav, the couple moved to eastern Serbia after Svetozar, who worked for the Yugoslav Education Ministry, was posted to Požarevac. In 1941, as Nazi German and Italian fascist forces advanced into Yugoslavia, they made the perilous journey back to Montenegro when Stanislava was 5 months pregnant with Slobodan. Weaving their way through war zones, eventually they arrived at Kosovska Mitrovica, a province of what is now northern Kosovo, where they were able to go no further because of intense fighting. Leaving his pregnant wife and young son behind, Svetozar pressed on further and entered Montenegro, where he found his mother and sister. 3 months later, they all returned to Požarevac, where the family spent the rest of the Second World War. Slobodan's first years were spent mired in a country where staunch resistance was being offered to Nazi rule. The communist partisans, led by future Yugoslav dictator Josip Broz Tito, recruited many fighters and informants from Požarevac, including Stanislava Milosevic, a fervent communist who hid fugitives in the family home and acted as a courier of secret messages. In 1944, when Slobodan was 3 years old, Tito's forces liberated Belgrade from the Nazis. Soon, Yugoslavia, a nation that had come into existence as a result of Serbia being amongst the victorious powers in the First World War, and which consisted of modern-day Serbia, Slovenia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo, was being liberated and coming under communist rule, with Tito emerging as the country's new ruler. The new communist Yugoslavia, like the Kingdom of Yugoslavia that had predated it in the 1920s and 1930s, was dominated by Serbia and Serb Slavs, who ruled over a range of other ethnic groups such as the Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, and Kosovar Albanians. This was a complex political situation, made more so by the fact that some of the groups involved, such as the Bosniaks and Kosovans, had converted to Islam in large numbers between the 15th and 19th centuries under Ottoman Turkish rule. The Serb Slavs were able to rule over this disparate country in the post-war period by leaning on an alliance with the Croat Slavs and other groups that were ethnically, linguistically, and culturally akin to them, within Yugoslavia, while the forceful rule of Tito provided strong leadership down to 1980. But soon the ethnic issues that were inherent in the Yugoslav state would cause problems. They would be central to Milosevic's later life. In 1947, as Yugoslavia was returning to some normality in the post-war era, Slobodan's parents divorced. Svetozar Milosevic returned to his beloved homeland of Montenegro. A deeply spiritual man, Slobodan's father simply could not tolerate living in the grey drabness of Požarevac, while Stanislava preferred to stay, as she welcomed Tito's communist rule. As a result, Slobodan was raised by his devoted mother. In the playground and in class, Milosevic, who was given the nickname Silky, was a weedy boy who didn't have many friends, avoided sports, and never got involved in confrontation. Instead, he devoted most of his energy to his studies, while in his spare time he wrote for the school magazine and diligently attended the meetings of his local communist youth organization. Like his mother, he was ambitious, his attitude only amplified by a general feeling shared by the first post-war generation in Yugoslavia that they were building an exciting new society based on the principles of communist equality. Beyond this, Slobodan was a man of few words, though as he grew up, it was clear that he was shrewd in terms of his ability to keep his own counsel and to watch events until he saw when an opportunity presented itself in a situation. In appearance, he was rather plain-looking and a little overweight, with a hairline that began receding from an early age. He would later be dubbed the Grey Blur by some of his rivals. However, as a communist apparatchik at heart, who preferred to operate in the shadows and pull strings from behind the scenes, his neutral features assisted him greatly in becoming the political chameleon he needed to be to succeed. Slobodan's childhood sweetheart was Mira Markovic, the daughter of two of the most prominent anti-Nazi partisans in Yugoslavia, Vera Miletic and Moma Markovic, the latter of whom had gone on to become one of the most important politicians in post-war Yugoslavia. Aged 16, Slobodan would first meet a crying Mira outside of the library after she had received a bad grade on her history exam. Eager to go inside to read her favorite play, Antigone by Sophocles, to cheer herself up, she would approach Slobodan in the street to ask for some spare change because her library card had run out. Seeing that she was upset, he comforted her, and from that moment on, the pair were so inseparable that they were given the nickname Romeo and Juliet too by people who knew them, while Mira dotingly referred to her sweetheart as Sloba. Bonding over their love of books and with a shared ambitious outlook, they were also drawn to each other over the pain of having an absent father. While Slobodan's had abandoned him for Montenegro, Mira's famous dad was too busy with the affairs of state or his second family to even acknowledge her. Raised mainly by her maternal grandparents, the only time she saw her father was during summer holidays, when the Yugoslav political elite assembled at Tito's favorite villa on the island of Brioni. An ardent communist like her parents, Mira was extremely possessive and protective of her husband, though she was viewed by many as a manipulative woman who whispered in Milosevic's ear, earning her the nickname the Red Witch of Belgrade. With Milosevic, she had a son, Marko Milosevic, a corrupt individual who would later take advantage of his father's reputation to start a shady business empire with connections to the criminal underworld. They also had a slightly wayward daughter, Maria Milosevic, who, as a teenager, would marry a Yugoslav diplomat and move to Tokyo against her parents' wishes, going on to later marry one of her father's protégés. There was a transactional element to Slobodan and Mira's relationship. His attachment to her would, in time, open up a direct line to the top echelons of power in Yugoslavia. This would begin to bear fruit in January 1959, when, at age 17, he was inaugurated as a full member of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, the ruling party in Tito's communist state. After graduating from high school, Milosevic studied law at the University of Belgrade and, not wishing to share a room with 3 or 4 others, used his party connections to get himself a single room. Because his brother Borislav, who was far more popular than his sibling, was best friends with the president of the student union, he received some preferential treatment in other ways as soon as he arrived in Belgrade. He was soon met by Ivan Stambolic, an older individual by several years who had connections within the Yugoslav political system and who would act as a mentor and significant patron to Slobodan in the years ahead. Even at a relatively junior age, the calculating Milosevic knew the value of having friends in high places. Stambolic would later ascend to some of the most senior offices within the government of the Socialist Republic of Serbia, one of the constituent parts of the Federal Union of Yugoslavia, an ascendancy which would allow him to promote Slobodan behind him. Slobodan's relationship with Stambolic would pay off as early as the spring of 1961, when Ivan recommended him to be appointed as the secretary of the Communist Party's chapter within the law faculty at the University of Belgrade. This was a prestigious position which could be used as a springboard towards a political career in Yugoslavia. He attended seminars on party organization, hierarchy, and administration, and was responsible for handling much of the party branch's paperwork. In this capacity, he knew he could exert some quiet influence within the university. But as he was climbing up the first rungs of the party ladder, Milosevic would be blindsided by a sudden personal tragedy. Back in Montenegro, his father, Svetozar, had grown gradually more depressed as he realized there was no place for him in the new a-religious communist society of post-war Yugoslavia, one which viewed the Orthodox Church as an unwelcome relic of the past. Isolated and alone, he ended his life with a single pistol shot in 1962. His son, who had only visited his father once in Montenegro, and who was not very close to him or any of his Montenegrin family for that matter, chose to continue his studies in Belgrade rather than attending the funeral. Still, the event and his rather broken upbringing must have impacted on him to some extent psychologically. It did not help that his maternal uncle, his mother's brother, Milisav, a former commander in the Yugoslav People's Army, also took his own life a year later in 1963. In 1964, Milosevic graduated from university. Thereafter, like every young Yugoslav male at that time, he completed a compulsory year of military service, after which, with Ivan Stambolic acting as best man at the ceremony, he married his beloved Mira in 1965 after many years of courtship. She gave birth to their first child, Maria, later that year. The family moved to a small one-bedroom apartment in New Belgrade. There, Slobodan took up employment at the Belgrade municipal government, while Mira acquired a doctorate in sociology from the University of Niš in southern Serbia. However, all was not right back in Požarevac. where, like his father, Stanislava Milosevic, Slobodan's mother, was struggling with deepening depression after being passed over for a promotion at the school she worked at. Her sadness had only been amplified by the long absences of Slobodan, who, during his university years, had hardly visited her because he preferred to spend time with Mira, which had made his mother bitterly jealous. These feelings of neglect, reinforced by the failure of her marriage, her career, and the pain she had felt at Svetovar's passing, was what ultimately prompted her to take her own life in the family home aged 62 in the early 1970s. The untimely death of Stanislava, who had always looked after and provided for him, was one of the few documented occasions when Slobodan expressed genuine emotion. According to Mira's half-sister, he blamed himself for her passing, and he was genuinely remorseful that he hadn't seen her more frequently. Meanwhile, in Belgrade, by 1968, Slobodan had swapped municipal duties for profit margins, having become an employee of Tehnogas, a prestigious state-run gas company. He owed his original appointment within the company to Ivan Stambolic's recommendation, with Stambolic becoming the president of Tehnogas. Although Slobodan had little experience at that stage in his life of economics, having studied law at university, he was a fast learner and by 1973 had been made chairman of the company. Then, in 1978, again with the aid of Stambolic, he was made president of Beogradska Banka, or UBB, a conglomerate of 19 Yugoslav banks and one of the most important financial institutions in Yugoslavia. There he proved himself to be a skilled banker, his frequent trips abroad giving him a good grasp of English and other languages as he visited New York and Paris regularly. In 1980, Yugoslavian autocrat Josip Broz Tito passed away, leaving behind a country mired in economic debt and political uncertainty. Tito had tried his very best to keep the disparate parts of Yugoslavia working in harmony, with their many different ethnic and religious groups, but shorn of his strong leadership, Yugoslavia would find itself facing an uncertain future. In the aftermath of Tito's death, and with the dynamics of Yugoslav politics changing as the older generation of politicians who had risen to prominence during the Second World War handing over power, opportunities arose for ambitious individuals like Milosevic. Amongst those who gained swift promotion to a very senior position in the 1980s was Ivan Stambolic. In 1984, he was inaugurated as the president of the League of Communists of Serbia, and 2 years later, he would become the head of the Republic of Serbia within the Yugoslav Federation. Through him, Milosevic would manage to acquire promotion to the front line of Yugoslav politics himself in the 1980s. First, he was appointed as the head of the Stari Grad Communist Party Committee, Stari Grad being the biggest municipality in Belgrade. He spent the next several years quietly building up his support base within the capital of Yugoslavia, while he used his influence to subsequently succeed Stambolic as the head of the League of Communists of Serbia in 1986, after Stambolic was himself promoted to head up the Republic of Serbia. This made Milosevic one of the most powerful political figures in Serbia and a rising star within the wider Yugoslav state. He only turned 45 a few months into his new position, but his future prospects looked bright. Upon his succession as president of the League of Communists of Serbia, Milosevic ended his other commitments in banking and pursued political power thereafter. His appointment had ruffled the feathers of the old guard of the communist establishment, many of whom were perturbed by the fact that Milosevic had spent so much time in years gone by in New York and Paris, associating with capitalist bankers. Some even suspected him of being a foreign agent of some kind, though there is no real evidence to support this. Nevertheless, Milosevic would have to prove his communist credentials to win his detractors over. To do so, he launched a crackdown on liberals and dissidents as his first major directive. Appealing to party veterans was just one aspect of his wider strategy, which also involved appealing to both the hardliners, the communist old guard, and their adversaries, the younger reformers, who had grown up in the 1960s and 1970s and had a different vision for Yugoslavia. It was an expedient approach, because at the time, Yugoslavia was at a crossroads where it had to choose between continued authoritarianism or to become a multi-party democracy. Milosevic was able to appeal to both sides by essentially speaking with two voices to two opposing audiences. Thanks to his time in the USA, he used the language of reform to woo those who wanted closer ties with the West at a time when even the new leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was talking about liberalizing Russian society and becoming more open to foreign influences. Like a chameleon, by giving off the impression that he was open to ideas from all sides, Milosevic was able to hide his true intentions, which had nothing to do with any sort of ideology, for his principal objective was simply the acquisition of personal power and wealth. Before examining how Milosevic ascended to ultimate power within Yugoslavia in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we need to briefly pause to consider the peculiar nature of the Yugoslav political system at this time. Yugoslavia was a federal state. Its constitution had changed many times after the Second World War, with a major iteration in 1974 being one of the longest constitutions ever promulgated. Such was the complicated nature of the country's politics. This federal system meant that a federal government presided over Yugoslavia from Belgrade, but the country was divided up into individual republics, such as the Socialist Republic of Serbia, the Socialist Republic of Croatia, the Socialist Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so forth. Each of these socialist republics then had its own president and legislature, with the President of Yugoslavia acting as an overseer of a sort of college of presidents. Until 1980, Tito had held this system together through strong leadership, but the Yugoslav constitution had even included provisions for the system to change once Tito died. From 1980 onwards, it became increasingly difficult for the Serbs, who dominated the federal administration in Belgrade, to impose their wishes on the ethnic minorities like the Croats, Slovenes, Muslim Bosniaks, and Kosovo Albanians elsewhere in the federation. Milosevic would ascend to power by appealing to Serb nationalism at a time when the Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, and others were leaning towards full independence from the Yugoslav Federation. His vision was that if the Federation collapsed, it should be replaced by a greater Serbia that would retain control over Kosovo, Montenegro, and large parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Croatia, where there were sizable Serb populations. These matters came to the fore of Yugoslav politics in 1986, when the details of a report compiled on the political issues facing the Federation were leaked to the public. This is known as the Sanu Memorandum, meaning Memorandum of the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts. It is known as such because a committee of 16 people from the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts had been charged with drawing up the report. It argued that the Serbs constituted a majority of Yugoslavia and were, effectively, having their dominant position within the Federation reduced by the excessive devolution of power into the hands of regional assemblies that favoured groups like the Slovenes, Croats and Bosnians. The memorandum had in part been drawn up owing to a crippling economic situation, as Yugoslavia had enormous debts and the government needed to figure out how to reform the system in order to make the country perform better economically. The memo argued that some of this was caused by the constituent republics that made up Yugoslavia being almost entirely independent of Belgrade's federal oversight, and the growing power of regional assemblies in Kosovo and other locations. It did not help matters that some of the wealthier parts of Yugoslavia were Slovenia and Croatia, a factor which was leading to growing movements for regional autonomy there. When it was leaked, the Sanu Memorandum aroused huge controversy and unrest in places like Croatia and Kosovo. Milosevic would soon come out in broad support of many of its findings and the wider cause of Serb nationalism. In 1987, Milosevic was ordered by Stambolic to go to Kosovo to diffuse tensions that were building up there between the Albanian Kosovar majority and the Serb minority. Yet, during a speech, he expressed sympathy for the plight of the Serbian minority within the region, declaring that the Central Communist Committee of Serbia could do more to address their concerns. He promised to come back in 4 days' time to discuss these issues in more detail. When he did return shortly thereafter, there were clashes between ethnic Kosovo Serbs and Kosovar Albanians, as Milosevic conducted a meeting with the head of the Albanian Communist Party, Azem Vlasi, who stood for a peaceful resolution of the growing ethnic tensions. The situation soon got out of hand as a Serbian protest developed and stones were thrown, prompting Milosevic to go outside and attempt to calm things down. As a man who was more used to inter-party squabbles than physical violence, he emerged looking visibly shaken, for the Serbians were not only protesting against the Kosovars, but also the organization he led, the Serbian Communist Party. Surveying the stirred-up crowd, he heard an old Serbian man shouting that the Albanian Kosovars were beating them up, to which he responded with words that have since become immortalized: "No one will ever dare beat you again." This was perceived at the time as a kind of battle cry for the cause of Serb nationalism, which Milosevic was clearly now identifying himself as a leader of. Milosevic's goal in presenting himself as a hardline Serb nationalist was clear. He was now trying to galvanize public support for him in order to outflank his old patron Stambolic and become leader of Yugoslavia. Stambolic was furious with his actions in Kosovo and censured him for it after he returned to Belgrade. The division between the two men became more apparent by mid-June 1987, when, during a meeting with his associates to discuss the Kosovo question, Slobodan revealed his desire to make Serbia a unified republic by joining it together with Kosovo and another breakaway state, Vojvodina. In doing so, he was creating a clear division between himself and Stambolic, who wanted to resolve the Kosovo question with peaceful dialogue, while on the other side, Milosevic and the Serbian nationalists wanted aggressive and decisive action on the issue to establish greater Serbian dominance over Kosovo. Tensions between the two factions came to a head at the televised 8th session of the Serbian Communist Party held on the 22nd of September 1987, during which Milosevic attempted to destroy the credibility of Stambolic by humiliating his right-hand man, Dragisa Pavlović, in front of millions of viewers. As soon as the session commenced, Milosevic went on the offensive by accusing him of trying to rip apart the unity of Yugoslavia, a rather absurd claim given that Pavlović was attempting to resolve the impasse through diplomacy. A vote was called, and the president's key ally was expelled from the Serbian Communist Party. The whole incident clearly signaled a break between Milosevic and Stambolić as well. In the aftermath of this triumph, Milosevic consolidated his ascendancy by initiating a purge of thousands of officials and replacing them with loyalists, using his position as head of Serbia within the Yugoslav Union to do so. The nationalist cause was galvanized through televised propaganda, proclaiming the Serb people to be victims of Albanian Kosovars, Croatians, Ottoman Turks, and anyone else perceived to have done them wrong over centuries of history. In October 1988, Milosevic would commence his campaign of national reunification by bullying the leadership of Vojvodina, an autonomous province in northern Serbia that was home to a multi-ethnic mosaic of Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Bosnians, Croats and Serbs, by sending an angry mob of 15,000 Serb nationalists to the government building there to demand the resignation of their provincial leadership, who duly obliged in the first of what has since become labelled as anti-bureaucratic revolutions. This was a new and dangerous type of uprising sponsored by Milosevic and often organised in conjunction with the Serbian Secret Service or SPD, that used mob violence to achieve its aims so it could claim that the, quote, will of the people was being carried out. 3 months after these actions in Vojvodina, Montenegro, the residents of which were very culturally and ethnically close to those of Serbia, was the next region to submit. And then, in November 1988, the entire Kosovan government was reorganized to install Milosevic's supporters. Not everyone, though, was willing to give up their independence, such as a group of Kosovan miners who, in protest, barricaded themselves in the mines they worked at and warned that they would blow themselves up if the Kosovan government wasn't reinstated. It was an indication of the conflict to come across Yugoslavia. As bands of hyper-aggressive Serbian nationalists roamed the streets of many major cities, Raif Dizdarevic found himself under pressure. Within the complicated constitutional structure of Yugoslavia, Dizdarevic served as the president of the presidency, meaning he was the head of the College of Presidents who presided over the individual republics that made up the Federal Union. He eventually capitulated to the demands of the Serb nationalists, whom Milosevic was now the unequivocal leader of in Belgrade. This included stripping Kosovo and Vojvodina of their remaining powers of self-determination and centralizing control over them in Belgrade. This set a dangerous precedent, one which suggested that Serbia could coerce the branches of the federal Yugoslav government into centralizing ever greater amounts of power in the hands of the Serbs in Belgrade. It was followed 3 months later, on the 28th of June 1989, by a political rally in a muddy field in Gazimestan in Kosovo, where thousands of Serbian warriors, led by Prince Lazar, had once made a valiant last stand against the Ottoman Turks 600 years previously in 1389. At this, Milosevic delivered a fiery speech extolling the virtues of Serb nationalism and history. This completed his metamorphosis into a nationalist figurehead. It also marked a decisive crossroads in Yugoslav politics. Instead of trying to preserve the Federal Union, the Serbs were now trying to create a Serb-dominated state in which Croats, Bosniaks, Kosovo Albanians, and others would be ruled over by a Serb government in Belgrade. The question was, would they accept this situation or respond violently against it? This period witnessed the full ascent of Milosevic to power. His actions at the 8th session of the Central Committee of the League of Communists of Serbia had confirmed his rise to power, and after it, Stambolic was driven out of Serbian politics, ironically turning to the banking sector that Milosevic had just risen from, though he would remain a critic of Milosevic for years to come. Milosevic had consolidated his control over the Serbian establishment in the period that followed, and from late 1987 was the accepted leader of the Socialist Republic of Serbia. He did not attain the presidency of the Presidents of Yugoslavia, but this became a moot point when, in 1990, it was determined that free and open elections would be held in the constituent republics, which would drop the term socialist from their titles as the Cold War came to an end across Europe. Moreover, although the position of the presidency of the Presidents of Yugoslavia continued down to 1992 before being dispensed with altogether, in reality, from 1990 onwards, the head of the Republic of Serbia was the head of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. As Milosevic and his allies in Belgrade set out to transform the Yugoslav state into a Greater Serbia, much like the Sanu Memorandum had suggested several years earlier, the President of Serbia became the de facto head of state. Thus, when Milosevic won the Serbian election in December 1990 with 2/3 of the vote, he was essentially confirmed as the leader of Yugoslavia after a meteoric political ascendancy in the 1980s. Milosevic's election signaled to the other constituent republics that a more aggressive stance was now being taken by the Serbs towards the other ethnic groups within Yugoslavia. Some portrayed him as a latter-day Slavic Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had started out as a committed communist in the late 1900s and early 1910s, and who had then switched to become an ultra-nationalist during the First World War. Milosevic seemed to be doing something similar, moving from being a communist to a Serb nationalist, and it was now imperative for the governments of the other Yugoslav republics in Zagreb, Sarajevo, and elsewhere to respond in such a way as to preserve their own independence. This would mean destroying the Yugoslav Union, which had been in existence for over 70 years since the end of the First World War. But local leaders in Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the other constituent parts of the Federation saw little other option. Macedonia managed to secede from the Federal Union in a broadly peaceful manner in the course of 1991, in large part because there was no major Serb minority here and little clamour in Belgrade to preserve this small part of southern Yugoslavia as part of a Greater Serbia. However, once Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina and other republics began to try and split from Yugoslavia and form their own independent nations, the Serbs went to war to try and maintain control over all or parts of those countries. The Yugoslav wars would drag on throughout the 1990s. The Yugoslav wars began in Croatia. Fighting broke out here in March 1991. It soon resulted in a declaration of independence by Croatia on the 25th of June 1991. However, neither Milosevic's government in Belgrade nor the substantial Serb minority population in Croatia was willing to accept this. Ethnic Serbs made up a sizable proportion of the country's population, particularly so in the far east of the country, along the border with Serbia itself, and in the south in the regions lying along the border with Bosnia and Herzegovina. Prior to the war breaking out, these Croatian Serbs had already engaged in an insurgency known as the Log Revolution, which commenced in August 1990. Their goal was to secure their position within a Greater Serbia. Consequently, in the second half of 1991, as the Croatian War of Independence began and then intensified, militant Croatian Serbs organized themselves into the Republic of Serbian Krajina, Krajina being a take on the word frontier, so that the Serbs here were identifying as frontier Serbs. The forces of the Republic of Serbian Krajina and the new Croatian state waged war on one another throughout 1991. Meanwhile, on the 27th of June 1991, war broke out between the Yugoslav government and an independent Slovenia, after the Slovenes also seceded from the Federal Union. Milosevic was opposed to using Yugoslav troops to try and force Slovenia, a constituent republic that did not have a significant Serb minority, to remain part of the Union, and after just 10 days, peace terms were concluded which saw Slovenia successfully establish its independence. With Yugoslavia now disentangled from Slovenia after the brief 10-day war, it was able to concentrate more closely on the war in Croatia and commit more resources to that struggle. However, things did not go well here either for Milosevic. By January 1992, he was forced to agree to a ceasefire as the newly independent Croatian state was recognized by a great many other countries internationally. The Croatian War of Independence would drag on until 1995, though as a low-level conflict with temporary ceasefires. That it lasted so long was because the Croats and the Serbs had become involved in a separate conflict again. In April 1992, the Bosnian War broke out. The situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina was more complicated than in any other part of Yugoslavia. Here, the Bosniak population, many of whom were Muslims who had converted during Ottoman times, were the majority group, making up nearly half of the population. Bosnian Serbs constituted a very significant minority, some 30% or so, while Croats made up around 17%. Furthermore, these groups lived interspersed amongst each other throughout the country, meaning that the country could not be easily divided up along ethnic lines, and a distinct Serbian part hewed off to form part of a Greater Serbia. Instead, Milosevic's government in Belgrade was determined to retain control over all of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Bosnian War which followed for the next 3.5 years would be the most violent front in the Yugoslav wars. Approximately 100,000 people would lose their lives here, out of a population of not much more than 4 million, while the long-running siege of Sarajevo became one of the bitterest military clashes of the late 20th century. There were soon concentration camps being set up in Bosnia, ones lined with barbed wire and in which Muslim Bosniaks were poorly treated and fed little. Bosnian Muslims, Bosnian Croats, and anyone who wasn't Serbian were tortured and indiscriminately killed here. Thousands lost their lives. Milosevic, it must be said, was not directly responsible for this. As the war developed in Bosnia, a cadre of Bosnian Serb hardliners emerged who acted largely independent of Belgrade's oversight. These rogue elements included the Serb volunteer guard led by Zeljko Raznatovic, a Serbian mobster and warlord who had developed his own military unit, along with generals like Ratko Mladic and the political leader of the Bosnian Serbs Radovan Karadzic. Meanwhile, Milosevic's support base was eroding fast due to an uptick in crime and poverty caused by the effectiveness of international sanctions levied against Serbia, while a refugee crisis was threatening societal stability. The commanders of the Serbian minorities in Croatia and Bosnia were increasingly refusing to follow Milosevic's orders. All of this points towards Milosevic only having limited responsibility for what was now happening in Bosnia and elsewhere. But in ramping up the rhetoric of Serb nationalism since the mid-1980s and emboldening Serb nationalists in Bosnia and other parts of Yugoslavia, Milosevic bears at least some of the blame for the events that were unfolding. While the war was intensifying in Bosnia, the Serbian position in Croatia had weakened. There, the United States, which had firmly emerged as the hegemonic power worldwide in the 1990s, as Russia collapsed economically after the end of the Cold War, preferred to directly negotiate with Franjo Tudjman, the Croatian president. In March 1994, having promised to give up his wider designs in Bosnia by forming a joint Bosnian-Croat federation, Tudjman was given the green light by the Americans, now acting as the main regional mediators, to banish the Krajina Serbs from the one-third of Croatia they were then currently occupying. By agreeing to these demands, Croatia was rewarded with potentially war-winning American military assistance, which was put to good use in May 1995 when the remaining Serbian occupiers were driven out of Croatia in less than 2 days, thanks to superior Western military tactics. This ultimately led to Croatian victory in the Croatian War of Independence and an end to the efforts of the Croatian Serbs to establish their own breakaway republic of Serbian Krajina. In some ways, Milosevic was happy to see the fall of the Serb Krajina cause, as it reduced the influence of Radovan Karadzic and the other Serbian Bosnian leaders who were fighting the Croats as well as the Bosniaks. The Bosnian War came to a climax in 1995 with a series of disturbing events. In March 1993, the United Nations had declared the town of Srebrenica to be a safe zone in the war, leading to the deployment of a small Dutch peacekeeping force of around 110 soldiers there. Still, Srebrenica was safe in name only, because there had been no official mandate passed that legally permitted the UN to take decisive action if the peace was violated here. This meant that when Ratko Mladic and the Bosnian Serbs entered the town and began separating males from females in July 1995, the Dutch troops and the world's media could only helplessly look on and watch as more than 8,000 Muslim Bosniaks, both men and boys, were systematically killed over the space of 3 weeks. This was unequivocally a genocidal act. As news of the Srebrenica massacre spread, NATO decided to intervene. Waves of fighter jets were deployed to bomb key Bosnian Serb military sites. The NATO airstrikes shocked Milosevic, who began increasingly to turn to alcohol to deal with the pressures mounting on him. At one meeting with an EU envoy to Yugoslavia, he was purportedly so drunk and incoherent that his foreign minister had to take over the discussion while his boss slumped on a chair. By September 1995, Croatian and Bosnian forces were sweeping through northern Bosnia and closing in on Banja Luka. The Bosnian Serb cause was only saved at this juncture when the Americans intervened to prevent the fall of Banja Luka, fearing that if it fell, it would trigger a fresh refugee crisis in the region. With Croat forces only 20 kilometers from Banja Luka, the potentially war-widening assault was stopped in its tracks by the US government, who now set about resolving the long-running Bosnian conflict once and for all. In attendance at the peace discussions, which were held at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, and which were mediated by a no-nonsense American diplomat by the name of Richard Holbrooke, were Milosevic, who was negotiating on behalf of the Bosnian Serbs, Croatian leader Franjo Tudjman, and Bosnian President Alija Izetbegovic. On the 21st of November 1995, the Dayton Accords were agreed, leaving Bosnia as an independent state made up of two federations. Claiming 51% of Bosnia's territory was the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, while the remainder was handed over to the Republic of Srpska, one which would administer the Serb-majority parts of the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina and which was to become entirely independent of Yugoslavia. Although both regions answered to a multinational central authority in Sarajevo, they were also permitted to keep their own armies, police forces, political structures, and judiciaries in an arrangement that's still in place today. It effectively ensured that Bosnia and Herzegovina became two countries within one. On his return to Belgrade, Milosevic was swamped with reporters and cameramen and given something of a hero's welcome. In the eyes of many Serb nationalists, the Dayton Accords were a victory. The Bosnian lands had been lost by Yugoslavia, but they had resulted in the Serbs of Bosnia largely being granted self-government within Bosnia and Herzegovina, something which allowed Milosevic to save face and claim a semi-victory in the war after years of bitter fighting. With the conflict in Bosnia over, Milosevic could no longer use it as an excuse for Yugoslavia's disastrous economy, which was badly damaged by years of international sanctions against Serbia. It had also been devastated by the endemic corruption of the Milosevic government. Milosevic used his preeminent position within Yugoslavia to pilfer state assets in the 1990s. Like many countries of the era which were transitioning away from communism, there was a vast amount of state assets being sold off or privatized during these years in one form or another. This process was slower in Yugoslavia than it was in Russia in the 1990s, meaning the government still had control over enormous resources. The profits of many companies and financial institutions were systematically plundered by Milosevic, his extended family, and those close to him in power. Much of the ill-gotten wealth was then moved abroad into international bank accounts. Corruption is a notoriously difficult thing to trace accurately, as people necessarily try to cover their tracks while engaging in it, but most studies estimate that around $4 billion worth of assets were corruptly stolen during the 1990s, particularly so in the middle of the decade. It is possible that Milosevic was directly responsible for about $1 billion worth. Shell companies and all sorts of instruments were employed to achieve this. It would ultimately contribute to Milosevic's downfall years later, though the legacy of official Yugoslav corruption has been considerable, and Serbia remains one of the most corrupt countries in Europe to this day. In 1996, in an effort to remedy the fiscal crisis wrought by enormous corruption and years of war, Milosevic negotiated a deal with the British bank NatWest Markets, one which generated billions for the Yugoslav government by agreeing to the privatization of national assets. This saw the part privatization of Serbia Telecom and furnished Milosevic with the cash he needed to stay afloat for the rest of his time in office. It was a clear statement that communism had firmly come to an end in Yugoslavia as well, despite the fact that Milosevic and the ruling elite had all risen through the ranks of Yugoslav politics as communist officials. Despite this privatization campaign, the Milosevic's continued to try and present themselves as adherents of the old system. Slobodan did this by associating himself with the League of Communists, Movement for Yugoslavia, a group which joined with the Yugoslav left, which his wife had founded in 1994. In November 1996, Milosevic sent this message to his new rivals, a united opposition group called Zajedno, by blatantly tampering with election results that had seen them win in over a dozen localities, including Belgrade, leading to the eruption of massive street protests which were characterized as being pro-fascist, so they could be violently suppressed. Watching from across the Atlantic, the Americans saw that Milosevic was now turning Serbs against Serbs in order to continue to cling to power, and so they imposed a new round of targeted sanctions, including the freezing of overseas assets and the refusal to issue travel visas for Western countries against key figures in the regime. The end of the war in Bosnia was not the end of the Yugoslav wars. Tensions had been escalating in the 1990s, in the region where Milosevic had deployed much of his nationalist rhetoric for the first time back in the mid-1980s, Kosovo. This small mountainous enclave in the south of Yugoslavia was dominated by Kosovar Albanians, but there remained a sizable Serb minority here, particularly in the northern Mitrovica region. In 1995, the Kosovo Liberation Army, or KLA, had started a low-level guerrilla war to achieve independence from Belgrade. This intensified and turned into a full-scale insurgency war in 1996 and 1997, with the KLA receiving extensive aid from its western neighbour Albania, with whom the Kosovars were ethnically aligned. By 1998, the escalating conflict had become an international issue, and the US pressed Milosevic to find a more diplomatic solution to the Kosovo crisis than what had occurred in Bosnia between 1992 and 1995. On this occasion, Milosevic refused to cave to American pressure and instead ordered a significant troop surge in late 1998 and in the first months of 1999 to try and crush the KLA's insurgency war and bring Kosovo back under firm Serb government. At this stage in his tenure as head of the Rump Yugoslav Federation, he was trying to galvanize support for his ailing leadership by putting on a strong front in Kosovo, having already lost wars against Slovenia, Croatia, and the Bosnians. Matters came to a head from the summer of 1998 onwards when it became clear that the administration of President Bill Clinton in Washington was not willing to allow Milosevic and his government to have a free hand in Kosovo. Clinton and the US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright would not commit to a direct intervention by placing US troops on the ground in the Balkans, but they did begin planning for an intervention of some kind. Thus, when Milosevic ordered an intensification of the suppression campaign in Kosovo, triggering a mass refugee crisis in the spring of 1999, the US-led military alliance NATO sanctioned a bombing campaign of Yugoslavia. Between late March and early June 1999, the US Air Force bombed Belgrade and other cities in Yugoslavia. This had the desired effect. Ultimately, Milosevic was forced to back down and agreed to the Kumanova Agreement on the 9th of June 1999. Through this, a NATO-led peacekeeping force, known as the Kosovo Force, was deployed to Kosovo to administer it independent of Yugoslavia. though it still remained part of Yugoslavia legally, while the war came to an end as Milosevic fully withdrew his forces. With this, the Yugoslav wars were virtually at an end. Some minor insurgency clashes in 2000 and 2001 aside. The period of the Kosovo War in 1998 and 1999 saw growing opposition to Milosevic's rule within Serbia itself. For years, his approach to ruling Yugoslavia had centered on stoking Serb nationalism and appearing as a defender of Serbian interests as Yugoslavia fragmented in the post-Cold War era. This had helped him to achieve power in the late 1980s and early 1990s and adopt a more authoritarian approach to government, but ultimately it proved to his detriment as he lost successive wars and proved unable to defend those same Serbian interests he had lionized. 1996 and 1997 saw wide peaceful protests in Belgrade and elsewhere against perceived electoral fraud. This escalated into more violent clashes between police and protesters in 1998 and 1999, particularly so as revelations about Serb actions in Bosnia and Kosovo grew. Matters started to come to a head as the issue of Milosevic being elected for a third term in 2001 loomed. In January 2000, months after the NATO bombing campaign, the opposition groups united to form Democratic Opposition of Serbia, an umbrella organization determined to oust Milosevic from power. Yet it was clear the ruthless authoritarian was not going to go quietly. When it emerged that his old mentor Ivan Stambolic, who had become a staunch critic of Slobodan in the 1990s, was potentially going to return to frontline national politics and run against him in the forthcoming elections, Milosevic had Stambolic kidnapped and killed in a special operatives mission in August 2000. Milosevic facilitated his own demise, not just through his actions throughout the 1990s, but in terms of how he managed his efforts to cling to power. On the 6th of July 2000, just weeks before Stambolic disappeared, Milosevic had the constitutional rules changed so that he could stand for another term as President of Yugoslavia. He then called snap elections for the 24th of September 2000, a peculiar move given that Milosevic still had nearly another year to run on his current term of office. Although Stambolic's remains would only be found in 2003, his disappearance caused controversy in the run-up to the vote. This, combined with Milosevic's spiraling unpopularity in the late 1990s, ensured that the Democratic Opposition of Serbia candidate, Vojislav Koštunica, won the election. However, a dispute arose over whether he had acquired slightly above or below 50% of the vote. Milosevic polled around 37%, but called for a runoff vote since Koštunica had not exceeded the necessary 50% of the vote. Mass protests followed, as it was argued that Milosevic was manipulating the situation to make it seem that Koštunica had not exceeded 50% when he had, and was attempting to cling to power. As the protests spread in Belgrade and other cities and towns, the president then argued that he would hand over power, but intended to serve out his term after all until the summer of 2001. This led to further protests, and finally Milosevic resigned on the 7th of October. Revised official election results that were released days later indicated that Koštunica had slightly exceeded 50% of the vote. After what became known as the Bulldozer Revolution, criminal investigations were soon launched into Milosevic's actions while in office. He was arrested on the 1st of April 2001 and charged with corruption, though the allegations raised against him related to just a sliver of the amount of money he had stolen while in office. More serious were the international charges he was facing, having been indicted for crimes against humanity and complicity in genocide in 1999. US pressure led to Milosevic's extradition to the Netherlands within weeks, and he was soon placed on trial before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague. The trial here would take years, with the prosecution taking over 2 years to present its findings relating to his role in the Bosnian and Kosovo wars in particular. As it proceeded, Milosevic's health was declining, and on the 11th of March 2006, he died from a heart attack while in his prison cell at The Hague. He was 64 years of age at the time. He was subsequently found guilty of having engaged in policies which amounted to ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and in Kosovo by population transfers and attempting to force Bosniaks, Kosovar Albanians and Bosnian Croats off their lands. He was exonerated, though, of the more serious crime of complicity in the mass murder and attempted genocide of the Bosniak people, with the tribunal concluding that actions such as the Srebrenica massacre had been carried out independently by hardliners such as Karadzic and Mladic in Bosnia. Milosevic's time in power was the death knell of Yugoslavia. In 2003, in light of its reduced size and status, the state became known as Serbia and Montenegro. Then, in 2006, Montenegro broke away peacefully to form its own country. Although the end of the Kosovo War had not specifically provided for an independent Kosovo, it was autonomous through the 2000s and unilaterally declared its independence in 2008. The Serbian state today only controls about 35% of the land which Yugoslavia did at its height. Moreover, the country has struggled deeply with its past. Handing over its war criminals became a prerequisite for EU accession talks to commence, and in 2008 and 2011 respectively, Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic were arrested. They have both since been found guilty of genocide and other war crimes and sentenced to life in prison. Serbia was consequently accepted for EU accession talks in 2012, but those talks are moving slowly, and a proposed accession date of 2028 seems unlikely to be met. The reasons are connected with the ultra-nationalism of the Milosevic era. The country has failed to fully confront its recent past, and is also one of the few countries in Europe which has retained close ties with Russia following the expansion of the Ukraine war in 2022. Serbia continues to operate flights to Russian cities, for instance. Meanwhile, in Kosovo, the ethnically Albanian government has engaged in persecution of the Serb minority in the north of the country, and tensions have flared there in recent times, while Bosnia and Herzegovina is run according to a peculiar governance system whereby there are effectively two countries within it, the Bosniak-dominated Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Serb-dominated Republic of Srpska. Although it rarely makes international headlines anymore, the political climate there remains tense and could boil over in years to come. Slobodan Milosevic was something of a chameleon-like figure in Yugoslav and Serbian politics in the 1980s and 1990s. After forming connections to the political elite in Belgrade as a student, and then as a banker in the 1960s and 1970s, he established himself as a notable politician in the capital under the patronage of Ivan Stambolic, in the first half of the 1980s. A meteoric political rise followed. In it were sown the seeds of future problems, as Milosevic gained popularity from the mid-1980s onwards by appealing to Serb nationalism as the multi-ethnic Yugoslav Federation experienced growing problems of unity in the post-Tito era. As the Cold War came to an end and the Yugoslav wars loomed, Milosevic was in an ideal position to capitalize on his stance to become ruler of Yugoslavia. A decade of misrule followed. At home in Serbia, Milosevic was highly corrupt and authoritarian. Further afield, he engaged in war after war to try and keep Yugoslavia intact. In some cases, like Slovenia, independence was established with minimal bloodshed, but the Bosnian War became one of the bloodiest wars Europe had seen since the Second World War, and also led to genocidal acts such as the Srebrenica massacre in July 1995, followed by a massive refugee crisis in Kosovo. Milosevic might have been able to later claim that the violence in Bosnia was driven by hardliners like Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic, and it is broadly true that he did not order them to engage in specific atrocities. But in promoting a radical Serb nationalism in Yugoslav politics from the mid-1980s onwards, Milosevic bears much of the blame for the ethnic tensions which led to such violence in the 1990s. What do you think of Slobodan Milosevic? Do you think he was primarily responsible for the bloody collapse of Yugoslavia and the genocidal Serb nationalism which emerged during it? Alternatively, is it possible that he simply lost control of the Serbian leaders in Bosnia like Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, who then engaged in ethnic cleansing? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.